You've reached Hotel Pacifico, your 5-star destination for BC politicos. Press 4 for room service. Press the star key for your hosts Mike McDonald and Kate Hammer.
Welcome back, guys. Good to see you, Geoff and Mike.
You too, Kate. You're looking well.
Hello.
Oh, I love this time of year. It's so good. I'm also feeling like a little nostalgic because for us, it's sort of our 1 year rounding I don't know, it's like our
That's
1 year
right.
anniversary of the pod. Yeah.
Holy
Yeah, a
smoke.
little. Our second Christmas together.
Aw. Well, we need to schedule drinks, so we'll save that for a bit. I'm excited though today. We have a fabulous guest. Our guest today is Murray Rankin, recently retired Minister for Indigenous Rights and Reconciliation and MLA for Oak Bay Gordon Head. He was the first New Democrat to win that seat in 25 years when he was first elected in 2020. Good piece of trivia. Before moving into politics, Murray had served as the NDP Member of Parliament for Victoria, a seat he won in 2012 and held until 2019. In that time, he was named, quote, hardest working member of parliament by his peers. His legislative achievements included winning a unanimous vote to provide compensation to thalidomide victims and chairing the Justice Committee hearings in the SNC-Lavalin affair. During his time in Ottawa, Murray also became expert in national security issues, serving 2 years on the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Canada. And before all that, Murray was a leading member of BC's legal community, working on a host of critical environment, Indigenous, and constitutional issues, which just means, Murray Rankin, we have a lot of things to ask you about. Thanks for joining us.
It just means I'm old, I think. That's what we're trying to say, Kate.
No.
I think you missed an important biographical point on Murray.
What I miss? Yeah.
I believe he's a major fanboy of Hotel Pacifico. So
You bet. As I said earlier, I've lurked in the lobby, Mike, but never been invited inside. So this is a big day.
Well, flattery will get you everywhere with us.
We'll get you an invite back, sir. Yes, yes. And just major points, sir, too, for just the fantastic festive background, the twinkle lights, the holiday vibes, very Hotel Pacifico, wood fireplace. I'm enjoying it thoroughly.
I'm expecting you to up your game a little bit on Hotel Pacifico in the same way.
Well, you look like you're sitting in front of the speaker's fireplace in the legislature. I'm just wondering whether you're squatting at the legislature and invoke.
Not yet.
Or is this the Murray Rankin Ministerial Library you're setting up in Oak Bay to commemorate your storied career?
Oak Bay backdrop, Mike. Typical Oak Bay backdrop.
Yeah.
Typical Oak Bay, yeah. Behind the Tweed Curtain.
Right.
Can I kick us off today with just some recent news? Because I wanted to get your thoughts, Murray, on the recent announcement. The BC just approved 9 wind power projects, 8 majority Indigenous owned, 1 is 49%. None have to go through the environmental approval processes. And I think this hits a few areas where you have some expertise. And I'm curious if you see this type of arrangement as the way forward, particularly on reconciliation.
Right. Well, I certainly think that everyone, including the BC Conservatives in the last election and the government of BC, the NDP government, are aligned on one important thing, that economic reconciliation is key. Partnerships, equity arrangements, and so forth. So here we have a huge need for power. Everybody realizes that BC needs to have more power going forward. And so wind power could be an important part of that. Plus, the wind power aligns quite nicely with the worldview of many of the Indigenous nations that I got to know during my time in office, concern about climate change and not wanting to get off of diesel power in some of their remote communities, etc. So I think it really is emblematic of the world we're moving into, where there's more partnerships and more economic development and stewardship by the First Nations.
Is there something sticky, though, in moving through that environmental assessment stage and getting rid of that? Or do you think that's, yeah?
I mean, it is a concern. I think for some environmentalists, that's for sure. But it indicates, I think, the urgency that the government attributes to this particular issue. I think that the key is that many First Nations see this as a future for them. Some, of course, have adopted the LNG industry as an important cornerstone of their economic growth. I'm thinking of the Haisla, particularly with Cedar and the Sea Listums project that the Niska are advancing. But for others, this is this is so significant that there's wind power and other alternative energy sources. The Haida have been looking at tidal power in the past, and there are, of course, wind up in the northeast in the area of Moresby and Soto, the Treaty 8 areas, has long been part of their economic plans. So I think that this is really something that will be seen very favorably by many First Nations.
And a lot of these, well, as you know, you wrote the book on it practically when it comes to First Nations law in British Columbia. When there's one particular site of a wind project or any project with one First Nation as an owner, there's likely other First Nations that have interests and rights over that land base as well.
Right.
And with the exemption of these projects from an EA, from the environmental assessment process, I'm just wondering whether there's a can of worms being opened that other First Nations may feel like they're not having the opportunity to, have their rights addressed, whether it's hunting or gathering or other traditional practices that may exist on that land base.
Mike, you raise a really important point. I mean, the issue of overlap has plagued economic development and First Nations economic development forever. And it goes really back to recently when the BC Treaty Commission was formed by the Government of Canada and the Government of BC and First Nation leadership. That First Nations had to indicate what the territory was before they could engage in treaty making. Well, obviously the incentive was to make the lines a little bigger than maybe the historical record would entail. So I do know that there's lots and lots of continuing problems with overlap. It was one of the most difficult things I had to address, frankly, as minister. But I think in something like this, there's going to be more sharing between First Nations, more partnerships between First Nations, and also the ability to do dispute resolution between them. That's something, quite frankly, that I failed to do as minister. One of the things we committed to do in our action plan under the Declaration Act was to create some kind of commission together with First Nations that would try to sort out the very things you're talking about. But, we couldn't get that off the ground. And I'm just hoping that in this next couple of years, that piece of the action plan can be delivered on. It's very, very important. But I think in partnerships, things like this, where it doesn't involve pipelines, inherently controversial, et cetera, will be something they can put their hands around together and make progress.
Murray, you were the second Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. First was Scott Fraser, who shepherded the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People Act through, and there was a unanimous vote there. You were much involved in implementation, and I think we'll talk about some of the specific issues that arose. But after the election and looking back on it, where do you think the whole issue stands now? You spoke about economic reconciliation, which is, in my view, an easier conversation to the degree that it's reconciliation. It's very transactional. What about the deeper issues? Do you think DRIPA will stand the test of time, or is it going to come in for some big changes?
Well, I'd like to start by saying, because we're coming up to the funeral of John Horgan, the anniversary, coming up this weekend, the state funeral. And were it not for John Horgan, we would not have DRIPA, the Declaration Act. I think everybody acknowledges that. So I just want to make sure that I recognize that. It was Scott Fraser who did the heavy lifting. We had hours and hours in debate. And as you said, Geoff, we had a unanimous vote, including Mr. Rustad. In preparing to talk today on Hotel Pacifico, I went and looked at the BC Conservative Party platform. And, I was quite heartened by what I saw. Yes, they say that they want to return DRIPA to what it was intended to be. We can talk about that. But I also saw on their platform concern about the drug epidemic, concern about child welfare, concern about cultural sovereignty and other issues, concern about land back, which I was surprised to see prominently in their platform. So I have always thought, since the unanimous vote, that this is not a partisan issue. I really believe that British Columbians want reconciliation to continue. And let's face it, the Declaration Act was the roadmap, is the roadmap. And, if I'm asked what I think were the most important things I did in implementing DRIPA and as minister, and I think it was just that, creating an action plan with 89 concrete things, 60 of which have been completed or started. That, to me, is where the rubber hits the road on reconciliation. Economic reconciliation absolutely is key. I know some some chiefs like Clarence Louis and Asuyas would say it's the only kind. That's not, in my view, the case. It's so multifaceted. It involves so many ministries and First Nations of all different kinds. We have wealthy and poor, remote and urban. So I continue to think people of British Columbia want us to get on with the Declaration Act, and I hope that the Conservatives on reflection will see that it's part of the platform, has to be part of reconciliation as well.
I like that observation a lot, Murray. Like, it's true. It was present in a way I don't think we would have seen in the past in a conservative platform. And there still was a lot of back and forth around it, right? I think it was particularly John Rossett's comments that he would tear up DRIPA and then sort of prevaricate. There was a lot around that. Which, maybe your point underscores some of why that got confusing, because I think John Rossett was trying to articulate that there were principles there that he really believed in and something in the execution he didn't. Picking up on that, can you offer what advice there is going forward to ensure that as we move forward with DRIPA, we bring people along? I'm going to, pick on the Land Act here and how that was one that really, I think, the rollout of that from a PR perspective, I think did some damage.
I understand that, and I wouldn't disagree with your characterization of the Land Act rollout. It was badly understood and badly communicated by us, and I want to accept some responsibility for that. But it's part of the Declaration Act. Section 7 contemplated that we would go into agreements with those First Nations that were ready. And I say ready because we had to do, under the statute, all sorts of engagement with local government, industry, with other First Nations. And we had to be sure that there was the ability, a governance framework available for the First Nation, that they were ready to do it. So, for example, we did it in Tahltan territory, a First Nation that has very robust governance arrangements, history in the industry. And I was very proud of those things. But remember, that's part of the Declaration Act. So I don't know if the BC Conservatives, in tearing up the Declaration Act, would suggest that that's not the way to go forward. One part of that, though, was to try to create a platform to do other kinds of agreements like that. And the Land Act is full of different things, from docks to acquisition of tenures of different kinds. And we simply, in the amendment that was proposed to the Land Act, wanted to say, if there's a framework of, let's say, docks or a framework of some kind of permitting involving the land base, let's not do it 202 times as First Nations get ready. Let's do one that would allow us then to replicate when each First Nation comes forward. We would go to the legislature, as we're required to do, to let the legislature know that we've done that. But I think that was understood as if we were somehow providing none of the framework that the Declaration Act entails. And we were just going to go run amok on the Land Act reform. And that's on us. We didn't do a good job of communicating it. But I still think it's the right thing to do. And I still think it's going to come back. And remember, it's one of the key things that is in the Declaration Act that got us to the agreement with First Nations. That's something many of us are very proud of.
One of the pointy ends of the Land Act debate was, as you just mentioned, the dock issue. And it kind of came alive earlier this year. And with various, well, at least one legal challenge. I think Tom Isaac, well-known lawyer, has launched on behalf of his client.
Mike, maybe for listeners, we should say what the dock issue is, because it's important to understand it sort of geographically.
Yeah, so, Sunshine Coast is where the epicenter of it was, but I believe it was broader than that in terms of the interest it was drawing, and where there's thousands of docks on Crown land in this region. But I'm just using that as an example here about the diversity of opinion within First Nations as well on DRIPA, because as part of that discussion, Ellis Ross weighed in, and Ellis had said DRIPA in its current form is complicating things and causing division. I look forward to what the court has to say on the legal challenge that's taking place as the dock issue. So I'm curious, what your debates or engagements with Ellis were, as legislators on this, because as a highly respected former chief and MLA, he had a different perspective, and maybe both trying to head to the same destination, but maybe seeing different paths.
Yeah. very good question. So the challenge involved the Pender Harbor Residents Association, who, of course, are, as you say, the center of the Sunshine Coast, where there's a lot of docks that were built on area that everybody agrees is essentially important to the history of the Sisha, otherwise the Seashell Nation, and all sorts of artifacts. There's no debate that there was important cultural history there that they saw being eroded by the plethora of docks, and they wanted to make sure that that could somehow that their interests could be prepared as expansion in the area occurred. And so there was a lawsuit that was brought. I think it's actually by Robin Younger rather than Tom Isaac.
You're right.
That we could
You're
quibble, but that lawsuit is before the courts and is really a frontal attack on the Declaration Act. And that's why I think it's very important that we engage, and the province engages robustly on that. Ellis Ross, I don't think, has the same perspective on the Declaration Act as many of his colleagues, including Mr. Rustad back in the debate. I wasn't there, but that's what Scott Fraser has told me. So First Nations are hardly unified on any more than we are. Their communities differ on policy all over the place, as you'd expect in a democracy. And Ellis Ross has a different take. I believe his single commitment has been to economic reconciliation, specifically, of course, in his community, the Haisla, and his successful acquisition of the 50-50 partnership on Cedar LNG. So we'll have to see what the courts ultimately say on this, Mike. I'm confident that we did the kind of work, that consultation work and involvement. I was at many meetings with those dock owners, and there were three or four interests involved in this issue. And ultimately, I think the plan was to have some kind of joint or shared decision making with the Sisha on dock management. And it was to involve the local dock owners for sure. You'll recall that when Mr. Rustad was the minister, he was in my shoes. He got another former environment minister from the BC Liberals to go and make a number of recommendations. And to some large extent, we were simply implementing the plan that Barry Penner had suggested back in the day. I'm not suggesting that we solely did that, but I think it's part of a longer history than simply, oh yeah, we had this dock thing and oh, it failed and it's now before the courts. It's part of a very robust plan going back many, many years.
Just as a quick follow-up to that, first of all, you're totally right on the Robin Younger point. But secondly, Ellis's point, if I'm paraphrasing him correctly, is that he feels Section 35 rights under the Constitution provide the tools for First Nations to advance their rights. And so DRIPA, like what is DRIPA providing that Section 35 is not providing?
Section 35 for your listeners, was part of our Constitution that 1982 enacted in 1985 when the Charter was implemented in Canada, although interestingly, it's not part of the Charter, not subject to the Section 1 overrides that the rest of the provisions are. But that is a document that confirms that Aboriginal and treaty rights are part of the Canadian Constitution. And Ellis Ross wants to put his cards, as I understand it, all on the table solely in a courtroom. Now, I believe, and I believe our government believes, and I thought those who who stood up and voted for the Declaration Act believe, that reconciliation is rarely, if ever, achieved in a courtroom. Those are the words of a Supreme Court judge of 3 years ago in a case called Desatel. Reconciliation is rarely, if ever, achieved in a courtroom. Ellis Ross thinks that Section 35 means we can go to court and have those rights vindicated. He's not wrong. But the Declaration Act requires every single ministry under the action plan, every ministry to do something about reconciliation. It's a political instrument that is command performance by government. And when I say command performance, Mike, I want to be clear. Every year there's an annual report. And it's like going to the dentist, or it's like the Auditor General's report. You know how well they're received. Everybody hides on a Friday. When it's dumped on a Friday, everybody gets out of town. This is the kind of accountability that is required under the Declaration Act. It's right in the statute. That, to me, is how we're going to get to a better place with First Nations in our province. And it's not just a courtroom. It's not just Section 35. It's part and parcel of it, but it's necessary but not sufficient, I would say, Section 35, to get to where we got to go.
Guess 'tis the season for giving, and for the next couple of weeks, we'll warm our hearts together with BC-based stories of TELUS's student bursary program, which provides financial assistance to deserving young people across the country who are committed to giving back to their local communities. And let me start with Yaya Bakour, who fled civil war in Syria and lived for years with his family in refugee camps before arriving in Canada in 2020. Today, at the age of 20, with support from the TELUS Student Bursary, he is studying science at Langara College with plans to become a doctor. In addition to his studies, Yaya gives back. He volunteers at youth-focused programs and those that provide food and shelter for refugees. He has helped to start a youth soccer program, a board games club, and took part in the Ride for Refuge initiative, a local effort to raise funds for newly arrived refugees in Canada that raised over $9,000 to help new families with housing, groceries, and education. That drive and commitment to give back is one of the reasons Yaya received one of the 1,000 TELUS Student Bursary Awards last year. Like so many other things right now, life as a student is becoming increasingly unaffordable. More than half of students describe themselves as financially unstable, according to a 2024 public opinion survey, and nearly half are struggling to cover the costs of food and housing. Applications will open again in spring 2025 to support more students like Yaya in achieving their dreams. You can learn more and donate at friendlyfuture.com/bursary.
Can we look briefly at Blueberry, Murray? So very different situation. Blueberry is a First Nations in the Northeast, situated right in the middle of oil and gas producing territory in the Peace River District. And they won a very important case, a BC Supreme Court ruling in 2021, that on their treaty lands, which were Treaty 8, as I understand it, I recall, that BC had allowed widespread destruction of the environment by oil and gas companies. And rather than appeal that, the government, which you were a part of, decided not to appeal, which was hailed by First Nations as an end to the litigation road you've just been referring to, and a move towards real reconciliation. But the decision not to appeal now seems to have been problematic because the issue seems to be running into difficulties on the First Nation side, and permitting continues to be very, very slow, if it's happening at all, for oil and gas companies. Is this a warning sign of problems to come? And what can we say to the business community about these sorts of developments when we find them not implementable? I mean, we started talking about how Premier Eby wants to blow right through the environmental assessment, but here, in spite of a decision and a negotiated settlement, we seem to be paralyzed anyway.
Well, I first of all want to agree that Blueberry has been a very, very difficult file. The Blueberry River First Nations, plural, were the amalgam of two different language groups and cultures backed by the Indian agent, federal, many, many years ago in the 50s, I think. And the community has had governance challenges from the get-go. And currently we have one, the chief has been sanctioned by her people, and some other councillor has not been allowed to speak. It's been a real mess in governance. And I just want to say that one of the key ways in which we're going to make progress together is when we work together with First Nations to ensure that governance arrangements are solid going forward. I have a friend, a prominent Indigenous leader, Miles Richardson, some of you may know, who has this famous line, which I just love. He says, you know, in real estate, it's location, location, location. In First Nations, it's governance, governance, governance. I know First Nations in BC, side by side, one of which is thriving and the other which is in poverty. And it often can be in the same language group, the same geography, but it has to do with governance. So First Nations like Blueberry have been challenged for a whole bunch of reasons. Some of them, as I say, created by the federal government in that case. And Geoff, you're right. The decision not to appeal the Yahe decision, which was the one that gave rise to this work, was a very brave decision that David Eby took when he was the Attorney General. Everybody said appeal, but if you read the judgment, I think it's 400 pages or something, you'll know that it would be extremely hard for a court of appeal to overturn all of the fact finding that the court found there. It was not just the oil and gas industry, it was clear-cutting logging. It was death by 1,000 cuts, as it was characterized. And so we thought we better try to do something right. So we've been negotiated and trying to get a solution. I admit that it's been slower and more challenging than we wanted, but permits are getting out, and we have to find a way to work more closely with Blueberry to address some of the governance challenges that are there. There are several other Treaty 8 nations, as you know, Geoff, in the Treaty 8 area that are, in fact, working very well on the ground with the oil and gas industry. Blueberry is one that presents particular challenges, and I'm confident we'll get our arms around this problem in the next little while. But I don't minimize it. It's been hard, and the business community has a right to be concerned. But I've tried to indicate why it was the right thing to do not to appeal it. And I do believe that we can make progress if we continue to focus on governance in Blueberry.
Can we do one more question on this topic and just stay with a happier example of the deal with the Haida, the historical deal with the Haida recognizing rights and title? And I want to just, I think it's related. There was some reaction to that deal, like some people fearing what the implications could be for private property rights province-wide. Let me ask it this way, like, do you think that was a good deal?
Well, first of all, it's probably the thing I'm proudest of. I mentioned the thing I think that's most significant is the action plan and reconciliation, but the Haida deal was certainly a highlight for me. I just want to back up, Kate. There was a lawsuit that's been going on for a couple of decades where the Haida have sued for Aboriginal title. And let's be honest, everybody who knows where Haida Gwaii is knows that there were no overlap, to Mike's earlier point. They know that they've had a strong governance regime. Back to my earlier point, we've had a Council of the Haida Nation for 50 years. We've had a very, very strong constitution for 20 years. They've worked it out in a way that is quite impressive. I mentioned Tahltan. Haida would be right up there in terms of governance. So we have a situation where we would be told by the Supreme Court, if we let this case go to the Supreme Court after spending I don't know how many $1 million on lawyers, that guess what? The Haida have Aboriginal title to Haida Gwaii. Now what do we do? Let me back up. Exactly 10 years ago this year, the Chilcotin won a declaration of Aboriginal title in the Chilcotin area of British Columbia. We're still trying to figure out exactly what that means on the ground. What about haying rights? What about forestry? What does it all mean? Is it federal? Is it provincial? All of the Canadian conundrum is all at play. So we said, let's do it differently. Let's sit down and in an orderly way, try to figure out what it means to say Haida have Aboriginal title to the Crown land base. It doesn't affect fee simple, and I can't, as Jeff Plant, a former Liberal Attorney General and Minister in my shoes, said, read the agreement, read the act. It's like 6 or 7 sections long. It couldn't be clearer that fee simple is not. Repeat, not on the table. It's just about Crown land. And I know people have played politics with this, but I think it's much better to be able to sit down and go by the forestry industry. What does it mean? Docks, they have fishing lodges there. What does it mean for them? Half of the territory or more is in some protected status. What does it mean for that? That is how we're moving forward. And, it was Gordon Campbell, who I think deserves a lot of praise for setting up the reconciliation board up there in Haida Gwaii, where they've already had on the AAC and other things, the ability to jointly decide things. And you know what? There's hardly been any rancor. It's hardly produced any conflict. They've managed to make things work up there together with the non-Indigenous community. So I'm very proud of what we did. The federal government is now moving along very, I think, finally to get to the same place as we are. So all in all, I think it's something British Columbians should be very proud of.
But do you think it's a precedent for other First Nations? Like, has it raised the bar now for what other First Nations expect on a government-to-government type of agreement or basis?
The bar is very high, Mike, because of what I said. Governance arrangements, overlap. You raised that issue. There may be places where that'll be very difficult. The circumstances are somewhat unique in Haida Gwaii. Am I saying it will never happen again? I hope not. I hope it can happen again. But I think it needs to be recognized the circumstances that let it happen in Haida Gwaii.
So on that, I mean, you've obviously pointed out that in the Haida's case, it's rather unambiguous on title in terms of their claim and lack of overlap. And then we just talked previously about Blueberry and the overlap there. And you can look at other places, Prince Rupert, and certainly lots of other places where there's lots of complexity. When yesterday the Premier spoke at the BC Chamber of Commerce, and his number one message was permitting and guaranteed timelines. Yeah. So obviously the First Nation question is a big part of the permitting process. And where we have these areas of complexity, should it be the province that's going in there proactively and driving, how this gets resolved? Or is it an industry responsibility? Is it the First Nations themselves who have to figure it out where they've got the complexity? What do you think we've been talking around it, but like, what's going to unstick these gaps?
I think, and that's an excellent question. I think the Crown government ultimately has the responsibility. They're the ones that have the province and the federal government, depending on the area, have a duty to consult and accommodate where there's Aboriginal rights and title. And I want your listeners to remember that that's not something we made up because it's nice to do. That's something that the courts have told us must be done. And so we're simply doing this in the shadow of binding court precedent. So just put that on the table. But to your question, the Crown has to do it, but the First Nations are obviously recognizing that their prosperity turns on getting this right as well. They need forestry operations. They need energy in their area. They need the jobs and the revenue for their governments to be sustainable. So that's why we think some of the stuff in the Declaration Act, like the Section 7 language, where we can work in hand in regulating things, can be a part of the future. So, for example, we could get permitting done much more quickly if there was a recognition from the get-go that nobody cares about that particular issue. Now, over here we do, and sort that out on the ground. So we work together. The industries that have been very successful have done just that. They've worked it out, and the First Nations have said, no, just that area is sacred. Do not go there. But you know what? Everything else, let's talk about how we can work together. That's been, I think, the prescription for success, and I think it can be replicated going forward. I'm very optimistic.
But Murray, I'd like to just challenge you a bit on that, because it sounds like you're saying two things. If the proponent can demonstrate that they've got a relationship with the relevant First Nation or nations, then I agree the government should accommodate to the degree it can within the law and all that kind of thing. But surely the proponent, it has to start with the proponent to create the relationship and demonstrate that they've done the consultation, not the government to go out and try to cobble it together in the hopes that something arises.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that the legal position is what I said. The government has a responsibility, the proponent doesn't. And it's the government that can infringe Aboriginal rights and title if in the right circumstances, if it's in the public interest and, the bar is met. But the proponent have obviously the self-interest of doing the hard work, the heavy lifting on the ground as well. And those that have succeeded have done just that. I think that both of them have to work together. And sometimes a proponent will come to a territory and put the wrong foot forward, and we're 2 or 3 years later, we're trying to extricate from a misstep that they made, and maybe they talked to the wrong people, or they ignored this, or they slighted that. I mean, this is all about diplomacy and good neighbor relations. But I think that the thing that a lot of industry recognizes now is that ESG is environment, social, and governance is really important to many, many investors. Some say trillions of dollars of investment are being made on the strength of ESG. I think British Columbia, if we can brag for a moment, has done a pretty good job compared to other provinces in trying to ensure reconciliation takes place on the ground. And so industry is going to be drawn to places where we have those kind of good relations. Contrast that to places where you have civil war when you try to step forward and do any kind of economic development because you ignore the people on the ground. And I think we have a lot to be proud of in the way we're moving forward. Oh, I'm not saying there's not difficulty. I'm not Pollyanna about this, but I think we really do have a good story to tell on the ESG front, which I know shareholders of many large corporations are very worried about.
I think this is probably one of the longer sustained conversations we've had on this topic. I'm really enjoying it. I could keep going.
I want to keep going for one more question though.
Go.
It's an easy one.
Okay.
Uh-oh.
Do First Nations have a veto?
Oh, it's an easy one. We are, in my view, we are in a consensus-seeking world. Okay. I think veto is a word that connotes arbitrariness and just squashing people's rights with a veto. That's if you create the conditions to demonstrate to a court ultimately, but to the community that you're doing your best to achieve an honorable, good faith resolution, then it's not a veto. It's not a veto. I don't believe that free, prior, and informed consent is the same as veto. I could talk about that for a long time because you know it's not a simple question.
Well, we have seen,
I honestly believe that.
I know.
Yeah, well, we have seen prominent examples in the last decade where West Moberly strongly opposed Site C, Wet'suwet'en hereditary level strongly opposed Coastal GasLink. And those projects went ahead.
They went ahead. They went ahead because there was lots of hard work that was done to try. I mean, the Wet'suwet'en is a long conversation that we could have. West Mo and other First Nations were opposed initially to Site C, and an honorable resolution was achieved. Look, at the end of the day, infringement can happen if it's in the public interest. Delgamuukw, 27 years ago, pointed that out. But we're trying not to avoid that for all the reasons that we see conflict elsewhere we want to avoid.
Well, yeah. So and thanks for that clarification, because I think it's important for our listeners and everyone to understand that there's no absolutes here. If that's an accurate statement. But I mean, there's still, as you said, there still is public interest at the end of the day under the Constitution. Right.
That is right. That's absolutely crystal clear, Mike.
Yeah.
Future guests are on notice that when Mike McDonald asks a simple question, he is being facetious. All right.
Simple question to a constitutional law expert.
Gas or electric? How about all of the above? Lately, I've been talking about how much we rely upon our province's gas and electric systems working together. We need both systems working together to safely, reliably, and affordably meet the needs of British Columbians. And if you're a FortisBC customer that qualifies, you can have all of the above, gas and electric. FortisBC has introduced a new rebate of $10,000 or more for eligible customers who replace their home's older gas heating systems with an electric heat pump and high-efficiency furnace. Speaking for myself, I like myself a good heat pump, especially when paired with a high-efficiency furnace. How's it work? A dual fuel system provides whole home heating and cooling and is a good option for homeowners who are replacing an aging gas furnace and want to upgrade to a reliable and efficient system, keeping their home comfortable year-round. It includes an electric heat pump for cooling during warm weather and space heating during milder conditions, and a high-efficiency gas furnace for heating in colder weather. So just like our provincial energy systems, you get the advantages of both gas and electric at the household level to ensure your home energy remains affordable, efficient, and reliable. Kind of like a hybrid car, gas and electric. Sidebar, my first car was a 72 Volkswagen Bug that ran on leaded gas. That sucker was no hybrid. Anyways, the new rebate is part of FortisBC's commitment to offer the next generation of rebates for high-efficiency technologies and systems to help achieve provincial climate action goals by harnessing the strengths of both energy systems. Find a full list of rebates and energy efficiency information at fortisbc.com/rebates. FortisBC, energy for a better BC and a better podcast.
Let's try and get to a couple more topics with while we still have you, Murray. I think, and one I want to move us along to is the other light, non-nuanced issue of national security and intelligence. You were on the Federal National Security and Intelligence Committee. You had top security clearance. I want to ask you, I'm going to start at the high level here. Like, how worried should we be about the degree to which foreign governments are interfering, threatening our democracy?
we should be worried, and we should have the right tools in place to get to the bottom of it when there's reasonable grounds to believe that foreign interference is occurring. We're a sovereign country. We have a national interest, and if a country wants to do harm to us in order to advance its own interest, then you're damn right we should get involved. I had not only was on the inaugural group of parliamentarians that when the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians was put together, I was very much involved in that. But then after that, the Prime Minister asked me to be the first chair of the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency, which is separate from Parliament. It's an agency that rides herd on the whole apparatus, from the communications security establishment to CSIS to RCMP and border security and all of that. So I believe very strongly, Kate, that we must take steps to protect our sovereignty. And let's face it, we have an inquiry now that Marie-Josée Augue is running on foreign interference, and she could not say that there was not, to use that negative language, foreign interference in one of the election battles in Toronto, in Don Valley North. And I just want to say, this is not, to your listeners, simply a federal issue. Mm-hmm. Two of the people on that committee are from British Columbia, the Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, Don Davies, NDP, and Rob Morrison for the Conservatives, an MP from the Kootenay, East Kootenays. So it's very much about BC. The Najjar case, of course, where Hardeep Najjar, a Sikh Canadian, was allegedly killed at the instigation of a foreign government, or interference in Richmond Steveston in other. These are all British Columbia examples. So I just want your listeners to be aware, this isn't far away. This is right here in our province. It's important.
How do you think this is going to play out then? Like just the federal election somewhere in the next year. Here in BC, we have large Punjabi Chinese speaking electorates. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a few things to unpack in that. I think there's the threat of interference itself, and then I think how the voters here are reacting to some of this news and how the various federal leaders have been handling international relations, the interference itself. What are the implications for BC?
The implications are huge, right? Both electorally and in terms of our economy. Ultimately, if a foreign government is advancing their interests by undermining ours, we all have to worry about that. I must say, I'm unclear, to be neutral, why Mr. Poilievre has refused a security clearance. I never understand why ignorance is a good idea. We know that Mr. McGuinty and the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians said that there were witting and unwitting members of Parliament engaged in this. And we know that there were efforts in the contest between himself and Mr. Aaron O'Toole to favor one candidate over the other. Mr. O'Toole was notoriously hard on Beijing. I don't understand why a national leader, the only one being Mr. Poilievre, would not want to know what happened, would get the top secret clearance in order to be told the intel that's known to the other leaders. I don't understand that. I think it's that important, and I hope that he'll reconsider his position.
Well, his concern he's raised is that he would be gagged, that it would mean that he couldn't speak freely to voters about what he knows.
I think he should speak with knowledge. And there's lots you can say without being explicit. You don't have to you can know the gist and not tell the details, the names, the dates, the places, the people.
Do you think it's fait accompli that Pierre Poilievre will be Prime Minister in 2025?
Well, that's a political question.
Well, you're a former politician, so why would I ask you?
I know that they're 22% as we speak ahead of the Liberals in the polls. I also know that elections matter, and we have a bit of time before then. But I think betting people would likely predict that the Conservatives are in a very good position. They have a lot of funds. They have that lead in the polls, and there's certain issues that we can talk about.
You sat in Parliament with him for 7 years.
Mhm.
What were your impressions of him?
I think he's a very smart, a very able politician, and very calculating. And I think he's been very, very effective in the last while. He's really stepped up his game. And I confess, I was one of those people who didn't think he would be elected leader of his party. But now that he has, I think he's done a good job just in terms of getting his position out. I think I'm a little concerned about the simplicity of some of his messages. You know, the little jingles that he uses. I haven't seen a lot of deep policy analysis. I really don't think Canadians, I certainly don't know what they would do with our economy, with the national security issue that we're talking about. I don't know where they stand on reconciliation. I could go on and on. So I'm very worried about lack of knowledge. But just in terms of partisan politics, I think no one can deny that he hasn't been an effective leader.
So you're not sure that eliminating the carbon tax will solve our tariff problems with the United States?
I don't know, but I can tell you the national security piece is certainly part of it. As you know, border security, or we've talked about drones and all of that.
Were you talking about Pierre Poilievre or David Eby, Geoff? I just trying to know.
Well, that's a fair. I wanted to ask you, Murray. Like, I want to turn that lens and that gaze to BC, and I want to talk about the election we just had. And I want to ask in terms of the discussions we did or didn't. Well, I want to say the ones we didn't have. I mean, were you surprised by anything that we didn't? Any aspects of policy and big issues to British Columbians that we didn't have discussions about in real detail?
I always took it as a good thing when we looked at the polls and it showed reconciliation in terms of the issues important to the public was kind of down the list. And, affordability, healthcare, street disorder, those were very high and continue to be, but reconciliation, not so much. And I always took that to be a good thing. It must, I thought, mean that people realize that we're trying our best to make progress on that file. But I was surprised that really didn't come up much because because it was so central to my role over 4 years that it surprised me that wasn't more at the fore. And I have to say the carbon tax piece, I didn't hear hardly any debate on that. Now that after the position was advanced by Mr. Eby, it didn't seem to figure at all in the debates that I attended or any of the media that I read.
Well, you saw the Conservatives kind of come out of the countryside and almost win ridings like Juan de Fuca, took a few up island.
Yeah.
Definitely were in the conversation in Cowichan Valley, and then, ran the table pretty much in the BC interior and the Fraser Valley. Right. So just kind of combining the federal NDP and provincial NDP, it just seems that both parties are in the cities and closer to the urban core than they've ever been before. And do you see that trend continuing, or do you see a way to, because with Poilievre and the conservative populist appeal seem to be chewing away at some of those traditional NDP voters that were in the days of yesterday were the IWA loggers and the trade union base that were often in regional centers, small towns.
I think that's absolutely key that the NDP try to re-engage in a more meaningful way with the working voters of small town BC. Absolutely agree with that. And I think there needs to be some soul searching. Why didn't that happen? What was it about the populist message that resonated clearly with so many of those voters? We need to, the same way the Democrats are engaged in the United States on exactly that kind of soul searching. How come we have Reagan Democrats, as we used to call them? How come so many of those people voted for Trump? I do want to say, though, to the NDP, it was the first time that we've had three times a government reelected. And I want to, if you look around the world, how many incumbents?
Hold on. Didn't get elected in 2017.
Fair. Okay. But you know what I'm saying? These lawyers
could be so tricky.
This is like the reason Mike McDonald does a podcast. So you can reiterate this point.
Certain bright lines that Mike has. Yeah.
There
my own bright lines.
There might be a bit of a problem around the world with incumbent governments, Mike. I think you'd acknowledge that. There aren't a lot, which is another reason why I think you asked me about Polyev. I mean, how many governments are being returned and how many are not? Not very many are getting returned. And I have a feeling that we need to give credit to the BC NDP for holding on to a majority government and in the face of what's happening so many places around Europe and North America.
Well, I want to stick with your call for soul searching, for the NDP and say one of the interesting things that happened was there was this kind of, it really was the suburbs around Vancouver that really turned away from the NDP. Whereas I think the island was stayed closer to the NDP. Like there was a little bit of a difference in what was happening there and who seemed to really be turned away. And I wonder if in that vein of soul searching, you see maybe some evidence of what voters were responding to when they were turning away to the Conservatives.
Yeah, I was so many excellent MLAs from the Fraser Valley, for example, were not returned by the NDP. If the NDP's success stories, I thought, in the Fraser Valley that didn't get reelected. But the margins were very close in some of those ridings. The other factor was, of course, we didn't have three-way races, so the center-right was just represented by one party. The NDP has succeeded when there's two, when there's this, like in Alberta, I'm thinking of Rachel Notley's success against two center-right parties. I think most people agree that was absolutely critical to reason she won a mandate in Alberta. But no, I don't know that I can distinguish between what happened on Vancouver Island and what happened in the Fraser Valley in any meaningful way. The demographics are considerably different, and I really don't have anything to contribute to that.
Well, I think we'll give you some more time to think on it and have you back.
Great, love to.
And have you back. Thank you. So, I think we had a long list of topics to get to. We covered about half of them. Murray Rankin, I want to thank you for joining us for the first time at the hotel.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm Hamas, and this is Simon, and we live in Surrey. We started hosting on Airbnb because we thought we had the spare room, and why not share it with people? When our guests come in, first thing usually they ask is, I'm really hungry, it's been a really long flight, can you recommend a place? Usually Simon is really good with that. He knows all the good spaces. Because we got a lot of good reviews and people commented on the overall look of the space, I was like, okay, maybe I can do this for a living. It actually gave me the courage to start school in interior design. It made such an impact on us financially, and I don't know, I think we're happier because we started Airbnb for sure.
Learn more at airbnb.com/host.
Hello. You've reached the Hotel Pacifico Strategy Suite.
All right. I guess this is our last strategy suite of the calendar year. We're not doing like a formal one next year. Next week. It's gonna be something a bit different. So let's call it. I'm gonna call it. This is
We
our
don't know
last
what.
trip.
Yeah, we haven't figured out next week
might
yet.
have
But it's
some-
gonna be.
Might have some New Year's
It's going to be
suggestions
fun
for people.
It's going to
You
be
just
next week. Let's just say we're going to have a holiday party
Yeah.
at the hotel next week. We haven't figured out how we're going to do it or how it's going to be decorated or what room we're going to be in,
Details TBD.
how much, we're all going to drink.
We're
Yeah,
going to work
yeah.
out our invitations for the first quarter, right? Who the special guests will be. I think we
Yeah.
should do that.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Stop
yeah,
over
we gotta get
promising, guys.
organized.
So I'm not saying that anybody who sends in an appeal to be on will necessarily get on, but they certainly get consideration.
We will.
Oh, yeah,
we will
reach out.
continue to air episodes in 2025. So that's a little
One.
early present under the tree for our listeners.
There you go. One more special episode, jam-packed with holiday cheer, nostalgic
We'll
favorite
have to
voice,
get
familiar
everyone
voices.
through the holidays that next episode. So
Yeah,
they'll
yeah.
listen to it.
Probably a
many
longer
times.
one too, right?
Yeah,
Kind
I
of thing
think
you can
so.
do while you're
I
while
think so.
you're cleaning up from the family gathering. Okay. Well, so then this week too, I think let's just to look ahead to that episode, I think we'll do some reflection on the memorial service for John Horgan, which is on December 15th. So it'll be over this weekend. Geoff, I'll be looking forward to hear from you. I'm assuming you're going.
Yep, and I think hundreds and thousands, maybe a couple of thousand others are going. For those who are interested in attending, you do need to have a ticket, but it doesn't cost anything. It's at the Q Center in Langford, where John often went to watch the Shamrocks, of course, and I'm not familiar with the total agenda, but I think it's a state funeral, sort of. I think that's the right term. A memorial service. So I think Carol James is one speaker. A very close family friend will be another speaker. I'm sure Premier Eby will be there. I don't know if he has a role. But there will be all of John's community. So if you search around on the internet for any news story that has the words John Horgan Memorial Service, you'll undoubtedly find the link to the protocol office, which will send you 2 free tickets if you want to go.
Probably be a live stream or maybe even on BC One.
Yeah, there is.
You would think so. Yeah, it's at 1 p.m. Sunday.
I'm pretty sure there's a live stream. I think I saw that somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. Okay. Well, I look forward to hearing about that. Meanwhile, let's talk about Mike McDonald's wanderings, because I think, Mike, you were with the BC Chamber of Commerce yesterday?
BC Chamber of Commerce, it's their annual luncheon with cabinet, where the premier speaks and then is questioned by the president of or CEO of the BC Chamber, and kind of an annual tradition that was started many years ago when John Winters was the CEO of the chamber. And it's typically a good event just to see getting everyone out there from all various industries and seeing all the new cabinet ministers. And the backdrop of this event this week was, the business communities, making a little bit of noise. This group's calling themselves the G7, which is the BC Chamber, BC Business Council, Greater Vancouver Board of Trade, Mining Association of BC, Council Forest Industries, ICBA, and CFIB. So the G7. And
a partridge in a pear tree.
And last week, conservative jitterbug / firefly / what's something that moves around very fast? What's a metaphor?
An effective opposition member, in contrast to many of the others in his caucus.
Yes. Gavin Dew. Well, we need
let's call it out. Gavin Dew's the only
hummingbird.
Maybe
he floats like a butterfly and stings like a bee. Yeah, maybe that's Gavin Dew.
I like that for him. Yeah,
it's very old school though, Mike. He's out there picking on issues and challenging the government on them, and you don't see that from other members of his caucus. Yeah.
He's so uppity.
Uppity. Effective is another word for it.
Well, Gavin appointed himself as Secretary General of the G7 apparently last week and brought them all together and did a lot of social media stuff and basically saying we've got economic concerns and and he's speaking to them and he managed to coalesce a group together to hear from. So
he created the G7.
Or well, I think
first to meet with the G7.
I think perhaps he's appointed himself as Secretary General of the G7.
So the legend in his own mind, which is not unheard of in politics. But
he's taking initiative. He's taking initiative.
Right on. Okay.
Anyway, and the point is that
and got some criticism for David Eby for not proactively reaching out.
Well,
right?
G7 members had been issuing sternly worded letters since the election. Didn't hear as much of them during the election, but since the election, there's been we're very concerned about the economy. And there's been a bit of a vacuum since election day, waiting for the results and the Greens and blah, 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 blah. And so there had been a lot of engagement from the province back to the business community. So they were getting a little nervous. Anyway, so that brings us to yesterday and the BC Chamber lunch. And if this was shaping up to be some critical moment of, business government conflict, that certainly was not the case yesterday. It was, if anything, it wasn't even a fluffy pillow fight. It was the premier going in and laying out his priorities and receiving some pretty softball questions and probably accomplished his goal of lowering the temperature a little bit. Sometimes just by showing up, that's the trick. But he did have
he can be funny. He can be.
Well, he had a funny line.
Yeah.
He was reflecting on the close election results and said he never wants to have to hit refresh on an Elections BC website page ever again. Which
classic.
I could just imagine him, 2:00 in the morning on election night. Am I premier? Am I premier? Am I premier?
Yeah.
And he said the election result had the effect of focusing the mind, much in the same way a hanging would. So he typically does have some self-deprecatory lines to start off.
Exactly. Yeah.
But in terms of his message yesterday, it was permitting, going to speed it up, guaranteed timelines, which we've heard. I heard this 2 years ago at the BC Natural Resources Forum 2 years ago, but all the things are going to be done to speed up permitting, and we're still talking about it.
Okay, but hold it.
Yeah.
He came in on the heels of saying there will be no EA review for 9 projects that are going to total, $5 to $6 billion in 2000. Like that is a bit of a breathtaking new statement, very close to what Marin Smith was challenging the government to do on our podcast just last week. So in the so-called G7, you have people like the Mining Association of BC, who, as Marin pointed out, have a number of mines ready to go and are probably very, very interested to see what happened in that wind call, because if they could get through the EA process in a different way, that would be a game changer for them. So I think it was a very interesting start. He also, as I understand it, said, look, we're not in a recession. We have economic problems, but we're continuing to see economic growth. And the problems are in people's homes, in affordability and cost of living pressures, in housing and that kind of thing. So I wasn't there. My takeaway, though, from people who were there, Mike, was similar to yours, that it was a pretty quiet day, and we'll see.
There was a little more heat last year, frankly, than this year.
Yeah. Can we, though, I think to Mike's point of permitting's not new. We've heard this before, but then from there, it's like, well, get shit done energy is one of David Eby's favorite energies. And it's interesting because I think, I'm sure there are people around him who are reflecting back on the previous term and saying that was one of your liabilities. Was your get shit done energy and your sort of plow through on something. And it's sort of ironic to me. I was looking at this thinking this is hard for him because he's got some problems that he's going to have to bring some of that energy to and find a new way of doing it.
I mean, it wasn't an unwelcome message for sure. Like the fact
in
that
that room.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that he's saying we got to do this, we need guaranteed timelines. Great. Like that's step one, is like acknowledging that needs to happen.
And yes, which is great in this room. And similarly, you can say the same reflection on the housing policy, right? Like it started out really well received, really good. And then you sort of get into the nuance and find the people who have struggled with it. You have your sort of version of the mayors. There's another version of this, right? And so I think this is going to be a challenge for him.
I think on the housing thing is interesting because there he insisted through Ravi Kahlon that the municipalities create these targets, lift the so-called barriers, get rid of the gatekeepers, and then the developers still haven't rushed to build in the way that people were hoping. They will not invest if they don't see money happening. Here, it's quite different in the wind thing because they have the proponents standing there with the First Nations who are saying, we really want to get started. And this is an existential thing for the First Nations because, to Murray's point earlier in our conversation, there's cash flow to the First Nations to pay for governance. And so very, very interesting new dynamic there. And it's happening inside the Premier's own jurisdiction, where he can go to the House if he wants and invite the Conservatives to shoot this down. I don't think they would, to say we really want to get these things done. And we'll see if mining is next.
It's not a good sign, though, when government has to exempt projects from its own EA process because it thinks it's going to be too slow, right? So, I mean, it is a point of reflection as to what exactly is happening with that EA process, that they're concerned enough that they have to exempt it.
And if you're doing the exemption on the argument that well, we know these are environmentally sound anyway, it's like, okay, well then why is that process so slow even in this context that you had to get rid of it? Yeah.
And I will say, and I assume there's still being some process involved. It's not like wind projects are without impacts.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there are going to be, I mentioned it earlier with Murray Rankin, there might be neighboring First Nations that have concerns. There are issues with birds, and there are issues potentially with tourism and other things. So somebody's got to be looking at it, right? But yes, let's get things done. Boom. 9 wind projects.
I agree with him. I can echo in spades for mining. And it was very interesting to hear Marin saying, let's get this done because we see that just the other day, or was it today, charges laid 15 years later in the collapse of that mine in the interior where the tailings ran downstream for 15 kilometers and so on. So the rules aren't there for no reason. They're there for a reason.
But at the event yesterday, the other noteworthy things just to mention here is Premier did use the term reset. So raising expectations perhaps that, okay, there's going to be a pivot coming forward in terms of how government relates to the business community. And he also paused to make it clear to everyone. He said, look, I want you to know that I know that I understand that business basically pays the bills around here. You can't pay for services with an empty cup, right? And so that was an interesting message too, that he felt he needed to let everyone know that he gets it, right? Now, again, proof is in the pudding. We'll see what comes next.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one channel to watch for what comes next is Jas Johal's Twitter feed. On that note, we have a clipping this week, and the clipping is Jas's Twitter feed, and a Twitter thread in particular about the turmoil within the BC Conservative caucus. So, where do we start with this? I want to step back and say, like, two good sources for kind of daily news on BC politics would be like BC Today and Jas Johal's Twitter, which is technically X, I recognize, but I just want to like
Richard Zusman's Twitter and Rob Shaw's Twitter as well.
But yes, but Jas has had some really juicy, particularly if you're looking for stuff on the Conservative Party. Like that's really been the go-to for a while now, and it's been really interesting, and probably more interesting than certainly John Rostad would hope. Can we start, because we haven't talked about it yet, with Jas releasing the letter from the 13 Conservative MLAs calling on John Rostad to demand that Elenore Sturko apologize for backing the Vancouver Police Board's decision to seek the resignation of the former Vice Chair, Comfort Sakoma. That was sort of, what day was that? December 5th?
5th, I think, yeah.
Yeah.
And Jas is calling them the cancel caucus. I mean, it is ironic that they're demanding Sturko apologize for expressing an opinion about someone expressing an opinion.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I think that irony has
in this way
come home full circle. But so just to set the table a little more, Comfort Sakoma made a series of statements that are objectively, in my view, hard to take publicly if you are in charge of such a critical body as the Police Board of Vancouver, which was that the arrival of too many people, I'm paraphrasing here, from places like South Asia was leading to too great an emphasis on holidays like Diwali, which is undermining the fundamental Christian values that are at the core of BC society. So very difficult to see someone with those views being able to dispassionately look at a whole set of issues coming across the table at the police board. And so the board, which includes Mayor Ken Sim of Vancouver and some others who are not notable left-wingers, said she had to quit. And Elenore Sturko, who is the Conservative critic for that area, agreed she should quit. This triggered a letter from 13 all-new MLAs in John Rustad's caucus. And so I just want to propose a couple of things here. Their letter was to Rustad saying, did you approve these statements by Sturko? Did your staff approve them? And are you going to get her to withdraw them and apologize? Or are you going to get her to speak to? And so there was a very, very carefully thought out letter, carefully formatted to put Rustad on the spot. So either Rustad knew the letter was coming and actually was kind of happy with it because he thought it would take Elenore Sturko down a notch. I don't know. Or he didn't know it was coming, which is a very sad comment on his leadership, if that's the case. But what he did do was then go off and see Miss Sakoma and make it clear in a further tweet that he thought she was a very great person and that he hoped that Elenore Sturko would not pass further judgments on her. I think what this does is show that there's a big group in the Conservative caucus who really don't like Elenore Sturko. They took a run at her, probably with the implicit knowledge of Rustad. He didn't have the guts to try to force her to apologize or whatever, because as Mike says, it's a free speech issue. So in a funny way, I think Elenore Sturko has been very empowered here because she just said, okay, free speech is the order of the day. I spoke of my mind and I'm not changing it.
Can I offer an in-between too to your scenarios, Geoff, just to say, like, John Rustad could have not known it was coming, been blindsided, and then also could have known it was coming. And then it was a strategy to take down Elenore Sturko. I think there's a little bit of an in-between too, where he maybe had some notion it was coming, didn't take any steps to do anything about it, and sort of decided the place for him to land was to align to the values behind it and not have to take sides within his own caucus.
Right. Yeah. Possibly. I mean,
This,
Tim Thielman, the
yeah,
research director, who some claimed was involved, no longer works for the caucus after a tenure of 7 or 8 days. And
Yeah.
so it was a grim outcome, and that's why I think Gavin Dew, who, as I was saying earlier, is showing some moxie, is emphasizing on the CBC this morning that it's important that they be a government in waiting and focus on the issues of British Columbia. So basically a bad week all
yeah.
around for the
I mean, it's
Conservatives,
not,
particularly Rustad.
it's, uh, uh, the sausage factory floor obviously was live streamed
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
Jazz Joe Hall. Um, there often are disagreements within caucuses that can get very divisive and testy, but usually they're kept inside the caucus doors,
Right,
right? And
right.
usually there's not a letter. No one
A
deigns
public
to put
letter.
no one deigns to put it on a piece of paper that can, even if it's private, can be leaked.
Yeah.
So this is a different type of behavior
Yeah.
for this Conservative caucus that we're not used to seeing from the BC Liberals or the NDP. So, so they're flexing. These Baker's dozen are flexing that they are the police, the the police arm of the true conservatives, or free speech conservatives, I guess, or whatever you call them, who aren't going to put up with any social conservatives being, you know, Sturko-splained or
Yeah.
otherwise.
Well, and Aisha Esti, the party president, weighed in the same vein against Turco.
Yeah. So,
Mm.
from a Sturko perspective, she was one of the early
I was gonna
switchers.
say she was a
Yeah.
linchpin. Yeah.
So
Hmm.
she's in a bit of a tough spot because she jumped in with these guys,
Yeah.
and now she's in a fight, in a scrap. Now, it's not impossible that the waters are calmed, but it doesn't feel like it's going to be. I mean, I I think a couple things out of this. One is, well, first of all, how many people are really paying attention? It's mainly just the insiders, and probably the conservative partisans at this point. I don't think the general public's really paying close attention to it, but it doesn't feel like this group is going to be very cohesive. And it does, to me, increase the likelihood that we may see some breakage in 2025
Mhm.
if they don't move to unify to some degree. Because hanging out there is this BC Liberal brand that's yet to be resolved. What happens to them in the future?
I love your undying optimism on that front, Mike.
Well, I mean, it's just nature pours a vacuum, and if you got a group that are going to go around busting people's chops publicly and basically saying we don't like what you say, you're creating you're creating more room in the center for a moderate option.
Well,
And
and
if
then you've got Chris Sankey, who was the conservative candidate in Prince Rupert, tweeting to Jazz Joe Hall he'd like to punch him in the face and drop him on live TV. I mean, this is somebody else who the conservatives put forward to stand for higher office. And I'm just wondering who the people were who slammed the lid on Kevin Falcon's coffin, what they're thinking about this, and whether they have plans to step in and do an intervention for the Conservative caucus. Because I don't think, as Gavin Dew says, they're currently in a government in waiting frame of mind.
well, I would not underestimate Rusted's wiliness.
Mhm.
Um, we've underestimated him before, and he is walking a very fine line here. Um, and so we'll have to see how this group hangs together in the next few months. But it is, I think, for uh, moderates who are part of the quote unquote not NDP party, Jess Ketchum's definition, that
Mhm.
this kind of stuff really turns them away.
Mhm.
And it's the name of the game here is to grow your market share, not to decrease your market
Well,
share.
anybody out there who's thinking they might be not 100% comfortable in the Liberal, I'm talking about the conservative crowd now,
Yeah.
with some of the positions taken by the 13, know for sure that they can hope for no support whatsoever from John Rustad. Like Elenore Sturko, as Kate said, was a linchpin. And she got absolutely zero from Rustad after tweeting something that was pretty innocuous about someone who's really very much on the margin. So I think that I agree, it's an inside baseball story, Mike, but a very interesting one.
It's interesting to think. So there's, what we know of how John Rustad is handling this, because I will say the reaction where he just doubled down and said, yep, I don't happen to agree with what Elenore Sturko said, but everyone gets to say what they say. It was sort of this interesting kind of it's like it's like a backhanded compliment. Like he's effectively saying Elenore Sturko can say what she can say, but I'm leaving her out to dry. It was really interesting. And I think for the 12, the caucus members behind the letter, they're going to love that. They're going to love that reaction. They're going to be like, well, great. And it's interesting because it's sort of, this in particular, like this was a letter, like imagine they get into something that really is sticky. Imagine they get into something where they truly are divided, and there's a lot of like, it's a big issue that really matters. This was a tweet that no one had to react to. So while I think John Rustad for now has probably done a good job earning some credibility, I think, with that bunch who really are in there because they want the freedom to say what they want. It's going to be, he's climbed up on a tall horse, I guess. It's going to be a bit of a ride going forward as the topics get tougher and tougher.
But Sturko's always been quick to get to the microphone, and that's why she's been a high-profile critic. And it's not clear to me how much of a following she has within the Conservative caucus, like leaving aside the baker's dozen.
Yeah.
I would say
because
none.
But the Conservative caucus includes former BC Liberal MLAs, includes other people that didn't sign the letter. Like there's whatever it is. How many do they have? 44. So there's 30 other
44.
MLAs that didn't sign that letter. So
31. Yeah.
and I think a lot of them will just be like, we want peace in the valley here, so
Yes.
So Elenore, don't throw red meat in front of an important faction of caucus. And so I think it'd be I don't think it's necessarily like we all agree with Elenore, we all agree with the 13. It's might be like everybody stop being stupid, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I think there's complicated issues that go back to Elenore leaving the BC Liberals in the first place. And when some people thought maybe she should have stuck there a little bit longer. Who knows? Like it's complicated.
Yeah. But I think we're all aligned in saying this in and of itself does not matter. It's what it portends that we need to watch in terms of management of the Conservative caucus.
Yeah,
no one's paying attention, right?
Yeah, and is this a caucus that's more focused on the culture war than it is the economy? And I think that's a lot of voters historically in free enterprise side are economy voters who are concerned about the economy first and foremost, and less concerned about the culture war.
Well, that's just it. Like if I'm Gavin Dew, I'm like, what are you guys doing? Messing around with this letter?
This
like,
BC Conservative group, and frankly the federal Conservatives too, they have found. In fact, the press secretary for Rustad during the election was writing about this the other day. It's the culture war stuff that moves voters to the Conservatives. That was his argument, and that's a point of view.
I don't see Poilievre tolerating any of this nonsense in his caucus. It's a vault, and the thing here is that. A lot of these folks arrive here and they think, I'm not here because of John Rustad, although I like him and respect him very much. I'm here because I'm a real force in my community around fill in the blank. I'm an important minister in my church. I have a strong following in the military community. And I'm using real examples. I'm an 11-year veteran of the RCMP, and I can't be muzzled about this stuff because my personal brand is more important to me than the party's brand. And everybody deals with that, I think, when new MLAs come in. But I don't see Poilievre tolerating the slightest bit of this kind of madness.
Well, I don't think he would have tolerated Sturko doing it in the first place. And I don't think he would have tolerated the letter of 13.
Yeah, very MLAs. Centralized shop, which we see no sign of.
Disciplined.
Yeah.
And it's a difference
so
between the
hard,
discipline.
Though, discipline is hard.
Well, you want to win or not,
Oh, yeah.
Do we? No.
I know.
Can we just win by complaining about the other guys? Yeah. Okay.
Well, that works too.
It helps for sure. Okay. We gotta go to the mini bar, grab a drink.
Let's raise a glass or take a shot. Time to raid the mini bar.
This is not our Hotel Pacifico holiday drinks. Those will happen in there too. This is back to the mini bar for the end of the year, where we raise a glass and take a shot, and we had a chat before, the three of us at Hotel Pacifico, about a glass we all want to raise, and we want to do it together for the first time. And we want to raise our glass to Grace Lore, the Minister of Children and Family Development, who announced this week that she will be stepping back for her duties to deal with her health and a recent cancer diagnosis. I've met Grace Lore. I know her work well. She's very hardworking. She just went through a really tough election. She's got a fabulous young family. And I think on behalf of us, I'll say we wish her all the best and hope to see her back soon. Yeah, Geoff, did you want to add anything
Yeah,
there? I
thank
think
you,
you probably
Kate.
know
I
it better
think
than me. Yeah.
Grace was elected in 2017, and almost immediately one of her young children became very ill, and that took her away from her work for months. That all worked out okay, but it was a real blow to the two New Democrats at a difficult time, coming so soon after John Horgan's death, but also within a few hours of that, if not the same day, Dan Coulter, who's the recently appointed provincial secretary, had a medical emergency, and he's been in hospital ever since. And we don't know exactly what's happening there, but he's obviously in grave condition. So all of those events together, plus all of the stresses and strains of setting up a new government, it's been a very tough few weeks for everybody there. But a reminder too of the tremendous toll that politics takes on families, and when issues like this arise, it's very difficult. So thanks for that, Glass, and we wish her all the best.
Yeah, and on Grace Lore, I don't know her myself. Yeah, I think she was elected in 2020, actually.
2020, yeah, that's right.
But what was
Sorry.
not unknown to the legislature, because I believe she had been a legislative intern years previously and got to know the BC Liberal side as an intern. I know she's got some really important kind of cross-partisan relationships and friends as well on a personal level. So again, yeah, we wish her all the best.
I didn't know that.
Thanks
That's
for that correction,
fantastic.
Mike. It was 2020. She replaced Carol James.
Oh, yeah. Right. All right. Thanks. Thank you both. And I want to thank Murray Rankin for joining us today. We'll thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS. We'll thank Fortis BC and Airbnb. And we'll see you next week, guests. BC, you can never leave.
Checkout time at Hotel Pacifico. We hope you enjoyed your stay.